Good morning, folks. Chris here with Indaba Africa. Something a little different this morning. This is the first strategic video of sorts for the members of Chris Wide Africa. This would normally be reserved for the Master and Commander level, but we don't have a large number of subscribers at that level, so I've opened this up to also the Platoon Leader level. So there you go. So if you're a member of Chris Wide Africa at the Platoon Leader level and or the Master Commander level, this video is for you. Now, I don't expect to see much of an audience tuned in here, given the small number of folks at that subscription level. But if you do tune in, you're a member of that, you are most welcome. And you have an opportunity to ask any questions during these presentations. So there you go, folks. Happy to have this conversation with you. And today's topic will be the state of U.S. and Africa trade, talking about what the current situation is with U.S. and Africa trade. And let's get started. So let me put that little, there you go, U.S. trade with Africa is the topic for this video. Right, the current state of U.S. Africa trade is interesting, to say the least, and it is something historically has been a minor issue for the United States, but important to Africa. Let's talk about that. So, for instance, this is a quote from Brady Southwick, who was head of operations for Cummins, a large industrial corporation manufacturer, and he was responsible for Africa operations from 2010 to 2012 for Cummins, and he said that until now, Africa has been just a rounding error for us. Now, he's talking about Cummins specifically, but what I'll tell you, ladies and gentlemen, is that historically, Africa has been a rounding error for the United States, geopolitically, economically, and militarily. And this is a phrase I've used for a few decades now. So when I came across Brady Southwick having used almost the exact same quote, it seemed like a good opportunity to cite someone other than myself. So let's talk about historical engagement in Africa when it comes to trade. Well, primarily, most of what the U.S. has been involved in since the independence era for Africa has largely been government assistance with aid for a long period of time, heavily focused on the health sector, education, food, and security. This is where most U.S. interest and most U.S. investment has gone for decades, ladies and gentlemen. That's where it's really been focused at for a long time. Looks like I'm not alone. Vihan is here. Welcome, Vihan. Welcome in. Appreciate you being here. Glad to see you. And someone else is there, but welcome to the chat, whoever's there. So as I said, historically, this has been a rather a focus for the government, not so much. Now, it looks like I'm not going to be able to follow the chat very well, so I'm not sure I'm going to pull this one off. But anyway, I'll try to check it periodically because it's not showing up in my stream because it's members only, so it doesn't show up in my stream because I'm not a member. You like that? Anyway, folks, so Vihan, welcome. And whoever else is there, welcome into this stream. So back to the topic here. Historically, the U.S. government has focused, United States has focused on government assistance to Africa, primarily in the healthcare sector, in education, food, and security. This is where the bulk of U.S. efforts in Africa have been directed for the past 5 or 6 decades. Now, there was a private sector approach to Africa, and in fact, until the mid-'80s, there was significant U.S. investment in Africa. But because of the developed state of the South African economy, many businesses U.S. businesses that traded in Africa kept their headquarters in South Africa because of advanced financial systems, travel, infrastructure, workforce, things like that. However, in the 1980s, there was a growing effort to put sanctions on the apartheid government of South Africa. As a consequence, a lot of American businesses saw it to be disadvantageous to have a presence in South Africa, and many began to divest and sell off their assets in South Africa, which by extension meant that many of these corporations no longer did business in Africa at all because their headquarters was based in South Africa, typically in Johannesburg, but not exclusively. So we see companies like IBM and many others who abandoned Africa because they abandoned South Africa over sanctions in the mid-1980s. Some of those companies have never really come back to Africa to this day. Others have, but many haven't. And that's had a bigger impact on Africa than just apartheid-era South Africa. So that's an important distinction to make. Now, another thing we should mention here is that traditionally, throughout the independence era, the United States has been the largest trading partner with Africa as a whole. Now, that has been the case for decades and only changed in the past decade, around 2013 timeframe, when China surpassed the United States as the single largest trading partner for the continent of Africa. So China's arrival as the largest trading partner is a relatively recent phenomenon. It's not historical. People act as if it's been going on for decades. It's not the case. In fact, China's trade with Africa was infinitesimal until the year 2000 when they became part of the World Trade Organization, and then it began to grow immensely after that. So that's an important thing that we need to dispel. It's a myth that simply is not true, and it merits mention here. So let me slide this over. I think I can see the chat a little bit better there. Now I can see the chat. So I should move on now and talk about one of the challenges when it comes to trading with Africa for folks in the United States is the U.S. and Western media's and pop culture's mischaracterization of Africa. The image presented by pop media, by journalists, by even politicians from around the world and the developed world is that it's usually an image of despair for Africa. And people think of Africa, they think of starving Ethiopians, We Are the World, Live Aid back in 1985, trying to get relief to starving Ethiopians in the midst of a famine. Or they think of Somalia in 1992. Or they think of the genocide of Rwanda of 1994. While all these are true and genuine historical events, the reality, ladies and gentlemen, is that it's a mischaracterization of Africa in the 21st century. So I like to call this the C cubed, or as I call it, chaos, corruption, and coup d'etat. That's the image that the popular media, Hollywood, the news media, and many politicians portray of Africa outside of Africa. Also one of poverty. When in fact Africa is the next bonanza. It is the next El Dorado, ladies and gentlemen. The most growth on this planet when it comes to consumer class will occur in Africa between now and 2050. Africa's population, approximately 1.3 billion people in 2020, will grow to at least 2.3 to 2.4 billion people in 2050, regardless of what anyone does. Those rates are already baked in. Short of a massive pandemic that wipes out tens and hundreds of millions of people, Africa's population will grow to that size. So the growing consumer class, in fact, is in Africa, ladies and gentlemen, and that's an important consideration. That's something U.S. business needs to take note of. Businesses around the world need to take note of it, and Africans themselves need to take note of it. So beyond that, it's important for people to understand that 21st century reality for Africa is very different than the popular narrative. What I mean by that is that Africa is not a continent beset by communism, socialism, and states taking over all means of production. That is occurring in some places, and we see this in South Africa in particular, unfortunately. But across the continent, the stories of turn towards market capitalism and towards representative democracy are quite demonstrative. The majority of Africa's citizens now live in actual democracies, which wasn't the case many years ago. So it's important to dispel these myths, but it's important for people to be aware of what's really going on. Now, historically, U.S. engagement with Africa was framed by great power competition with the Soviet Union. But since the end of the Cold War, that has largely been absent. Now, there's this narrative that's currently out there that the U.S. and China are competing for Africa, and I don't entirely agree with that narrative. I think that it's overblown by all parties, and that it's less a competition because the U.S. is barely engaged in such a thing. It's more talking points for politicians. Our policy since the end of the Cold War is effectively without a Soviet counterweight has allowed the U.S. to kind of stumble through its foreign policy and its Africa policy. And I would say that we've done this with virtually no competition until very recently with the Chinese. So U.S. trade with Africa, let's take a look at the past decade or so, and these are the most recent figures available. So U.S. trade with Africa over the last decade is interesting in that it's focused on some of these things here, and I'll point out some of these exports. You can see exports and imports to and from Africa from the year 2009 to the year 2018, and you'll see that the total figure in 2009 was a $38 billion deficit for the United States, and the cumulative total deficit is $223 billion over a 10-year period. So about $23 billion a year deficit. Only 2 years did we have a surplus with all of Africa. That was 2014, 2015, and it was a tiny surplus. So you can see trade for Africa with the U.S. is advantageous to Africans and disadvantageous for the U.S. in terms of trade deficits. We run a trade deficit with Africa, but it's an infinitesimal deficit, not even noticed by the United States. So historically, over this time period, much of what the U.S. has traded with Africa has been in hydrocarbons, specifically petroleum. We're thinking of Niger Delta oil from Nigeria and also other locations around the continent. This has been a major source of trading for the U.S. And you can see the volume of trade ebb and flow with the supply and demand of petroleum, particularly the demand from the U.S. Now, as I mentioned, in 2013, thereabouts, the United States stopped being Africa's largest trading partner, and now it's China. U.S. is a distant second at this point. The thing about the trade with Africa, though, is that our trade is largely concentrated in just a few countries, ladies and gentlemen. It's not as if every country receives U.S. interest equally. It's very much concentrated in a few places. Nigeria, South Africa, and a handful of other countries receive most U.S. attention when it comes to trade. Now, we're mostly talking about major corporations, although the number of companies that reportedly do business in Africa is 30,000 U.S. firms do business in Africa. That is primarily small businesses, but the volume of trade, the dollar value of it is dominated by the large corporations, companies like Boeing, Caterpillar, Microsoft, Google, companies like that. That's most of the revenue is from those handful of large companies. The rest of those 30,000 companies do very little in the way of trade, and many of them actually are kind of just not really much in the way of creating anything, just shipping things. So anyway, it's not massive impact there. Now, here's the thing about Africa, ladies and gentlemen, and we need to point this out. In 2017, Africa's gross domestic product was $2.19 trillion. Sounds impressive, yes? It's not really. It's not really. That's 55 countries, 55 countries. And it's important to Africa, right? Very important to Africa, how much the continent produces. But the U.S. GDP in 2018, which is a more recent figure, but almost the same, was $21.5 trillion. And today in 2020, before COVID-19, that figure was over 23, nearly $24 trillion per year. You can see the entire continent of Africa, 1.3 trillion people, or billion people, 1.3 billion people, is simply a rounding error when it comes to dollar value for what the 330 million people in the United States produce each year. 330 million people, $23 trillion. 1.3 billion people in Africa, $2.2 trillion. There's very little comparison there. As a consequence, Africa's trade with the U.S. is very important to Africans, particularly a few countries. But U.S. trade with Africa is infinitesimal and is merely a rounding error. It's less than 1% of U.S. trade, well under 1%. Now, just to compare, in Africa, gross domestic product per capita is less than $1,600 per year, whereas in the U.S. it's $57,000. Those figures increased since then. The U.S. is now about $64,000 per year. So you can see a massive difference in wealth between the two continents. Now, the African Growth and Opportunity Act is something that has been out there for a number of years, 20 years approximately, and it's a preferential trade scheme in which African countries who meet governance standards are able to ship their goods and services to the United States duty-free. It's quite a good deal. The conditions are not particularly onerous, and there's a lot of countries, honestly, that shouldn't even be approved for this. At this point, South Africa, for instance, because it's race-based racial legislation discriminating against minorities, honestly shouldn't be part of AGOA, but it is. And there are many other countries that shouldn't be part of it, but the U.S. government has looked the other way or relaxed the standards to allow these countries to participate in the African Growth and Opportunity Act. Now, some people hail it as a panacea. It's a great, wondrous thing. Others say it has no value, and yet others know nothing about trade and talk about, unfair trade and how the West exploits Africa when they don't know what they're talking about. The reality here is that if you qualify for AGOA, which is over 30 countries in Africa, you can export your goods and services to the United States with no duty. As a consequence, we see things like in South Africa where they produce BMWs in the Eastern Cape, they produce spare parts for those vehicles. Those spare parts can be shipped to the United States duty-free. They're imported here, no duty. Compared to BMW parts manufactured in Germany, which come to the U.S. with duty. And so there's an advantage, an artificial advantage created for South Africans in that and many other markets. But not just South Africans, it's across the continent. So it's important to understand that AGOA can be something that African producers can take advantage of in many cases, but it's not a panacea and it doesn't do much in the way of increasing U.S.-Africa trade. Now, the Trump administration has announced when a former National Security Advisor, Ambassador John Bolton, before he revolted from the administration, announced a couple of years ago in December of 2018 that the Trump administration prefers a bilateral approach to Africa. Now, this is problematic because many countries in Africa keep looking to the African Union to be their source to negotiate with external actors when it comes to trade, whereas the U.S. has a preference for working bilaterally with partners. So we want to deal with South Africa. We want to deal with Mozambique. We want to deal with Namibia. We don't want to deal with the African Union. And there's good reasons why the Trump administration does that. But that is a system that is beneficial to the U.S. 330 million consumers, population, negotiating with Namibia with 2.6 million people. Who has the advantage there? The U.S. has a massive advantage. And so that's understandable why African countries would like to pool their resources and have the African Union represent their trade interests with external partners, because then you're talking about 1.3 billion people and a continent with $2.2 trillion of economy versus a small country, say like Botswana, with 2 million people and less than $20 billion of economy. So there you go, GDP. So that's an important consideration. Now, the Trump administration announced Prosper Africa, which seemed to hold promise, but we've seen very little of this in the ensuing time since then. Now, if you look at this on the trade over here, imports from Africa, the U.S. was importing in 2009 $62 billion a year. Well, it was because we're importing a lot of petroleum. The U.S. is now the world's largest petroleum producer and the world's largest energy producer. So we're not importing this oil from West Africa in particular. And as a consequence, you'll notice over time, our imports from Africa drop demonstrably. Now, U.S. exports to Africa have remained consistent between about $25 and $40 billion. But our imports, those are exports, imports have gone from $62 billion down to about $35 billion per year. And that's primarily as a result of not buying oil from Africa. So why does this matter? Well, Africa trade, U.S. Africa trade represents less than 1% of our total GDP. If the U.S. didn't trade with Africa, we wouldn't even notice it. And people always go, well, what about coltan? Well, what about coltan? There are alternatives. They may not be as feasible or economical or better choices, but you don't have to get that sort of thing. What about copper? We get copper from Chile, we get copper from the United States, we get copper from elsewhere. So the reality here is that Africa is less than 1%. The trade with Africa is less than 1% of our GDP. So almost no one in America, except for certain businesses, would notice no trade with Africa. Whereas for Africa, trade with the U.S. represents 4% of Africa's GDP. That's not anything to sneeze about. That makes a significant difference for anyone who ships to the United States. 4% of African GDP is with the U.S. That is significant. Now, some businesses, U.S. businesses that are in Africa, are there. You see famous brands like, of course, Apple, Nike, Tommy Hilfiger, Levi Strauss, Coca-Cola, and Anadarko, which is involved in gas exploration and things like that. But the U.S. private sector, by and large, is disengaged from business in Africa and not really paying attention to it. Few businesses really look at Africa and treat it as a burgeoning opportunity. Rather, they see it as a periphery interest or a tertiary segment of their business, not a focus and a place where they're going to go. And my argument for U.S. businesses, they need to wake up and see that it needs to be a primary focus because Africa's consumer class will grow exponentially, not arithmetically, but exponentially. And we will see probably by the year 2050 as many as 800, 900 million consumers with disposable income in Africa. Now that's 3 times the size of the United States today, and that includes everyone, not just the consumer class. So that's a massive market, and those who have strategic vision will be looking at this and realizing where Africa is going and the opportunities so that both Africa and America can prosper from this. Now, hydrocarbons, heavy equipment like tractors and heavy earth movers and things like that from Caterpillar and Cummins, trucks from Cummins and things like that. So hydrocarbons, heavy equipment, and aircraft have been the main focus for U.S. companies that are in Africa. So I mentioned aircraft. Boeing, of course, sells aircraft all over Africa. Now, in addition to this, I should say that the U.S. is not effectively competing either the private or the public sector. It's not doing a very good job, and that's mostly because of neglect and a lack of interest. But here's the thing. Here's the irony, ladies and gentlemen. The United States remains wildly popular. U.S. businesses are wildly popular across Africa. If we look at African consumers, they normally look to American products. That's their preferred choice. They're not looking for Chinese products. No one wants to buy a Chery car, not if they have a choice. They much prefer to buy a General Motors product. So if we look at this, 29 of Africa's top brands, according to consumers, are American. 29 of 100 brands in Africa, for all of Africa, the top brands in Africa people know, respect, and want to buy are American brands. And that's without even trying. China, by comparison, has 7 brands that are in the top 100, most nowhere near the top of the list. So without even trying, American brands are successful in Africa, with the exception of Coca-Cola, of course, which tries very hard in Africa. But there are very few American brands beyond Coca-Cola that put much energy, effort, and advertising and trying to capture consumers in Africa beyond Coca-Cola. There are a few, but most don't. And so despite that neglect, the U.S. has 29 brands that are among the top 100 in Africa. Can you imagine that? Just imagine if the U.S. actually put any effort, U.S. private business put any effort into getting people to buy their products in Africa, just how successful they could be. The U.S., while it's no longer the largest trading partner with Africa, it does remain the top source of foreign direct investment across the continent, although that is being challenged these days by China. But there's some challenges for U.S. businesses. There's a reason why you don't see them there. It's not simply that they don't want to be present. It's that there are challenges for U.S. businesses. And I should talk about some of these challenges. So let me get into that right now. And I'll share with you some of the challenges that U.S. businesses face in Africa. So for instance, across the continent, you have protectionist policies, genuine and artificial barriers are put up to prevent business from doing business in Africa, businesses from coming to Africa. Now, for instance, you have local ownership requirements. Zimbabwe is a good case of this with discrimination, and Liberia is another. So, for instance, local ownership requirements in Zimbabwe famously passed something called an indigenization law, which required that that anyone outside of Zimbabwe had to sell 51% of their equity or give 51% of their equity to a Zimbabwean. But not just any Zimbabwean, a black Zimbabwean. So a white or mixed race Indian Zimbabwean didn't count. You had to give 51% of your equity to a black Zimbabwean. Now, who is going to want to do business in a country in which you're required to turn over half of your company to someone who has no interest in your company whatsoever and turn control of it over to a person from that country? That's just insane. So that is a problem in some countries. Now, Liberia, discrimination is an issue. The Liberian Constitution forbids anyone but black Africans from owning land. Now, how can you have a business, go build a factory somewhere or set up a shopping mall or set up a coffee shop, but not be able to own property? That's just insane. It's also racially discriminatory, but that is the law in Liberia. So there are real barriers like this to prevent American business from coming in. So Vihan has a comment or a question here. Let me get to that very quickly. Recently imported Milwaukee tools at 46% of the cost compared to if I were to buy it locally. Wow, that's amazing. That's amazing, Vihan, that you got those at such a good price. Interesting, but that may be a combination of factors about where your products are actually coming from. So, but thank you for sharing that. Now, Tanzania, for instance, requires mining concessions, just as one example. So they require mining companies that want to do business there to turn over parts of that either to the government or to investors locally. Yeah, not to mention the taxes, excise taxes, and mining taxes, and income taxes that are placed on companies to fleece them of their money that goes into these things. So these are actually protectionist policies meant to exclude foreign businesses from doing business in Africa. So governments themselves in Africa are part of the problem in many cases. Now, another problem is that most of Africa has a very weak manufacturing sector. As a consequence, many businesses have to import parts and things to meet their needs. You can't simply get replacement parts because there's no manufacturing base around you to get them. They either come from India or from China or from Europe, somewhere like that. You can't get them in the country where you live at. And that's a problem. If you have air conditioners in your business and they break down and you can't get the parts for them, you have to wait for them to come from abroad, that's a serious problem. So the lack of a effective manufacturing sector is a significant challenge for doing business in Africa. There's also, and of course this is one people famously talk about, infrastructure gaps. So for instance, when you look at infrastructure across the continent, there are a lot of challenges with infrastructure in Africa. And that's in air, roads, rail, ports, and information technology. Lack of internet capacity is a major problem for Africa. Next thing is, I should talk about here, is internal stability. Even stable countries can have problems. So let me point this out. So since 2000, Zimbabwe, Malawi, South Africa, the Gambia, Mali, South Sudan, the Central African Republic, Somalia, and Comoros have all had significant problems. So what am I talking about? Well, Zimbabwe, of course, has famously abrogated the rule of law. They've sent government-sponsored thugs to murder farm workers and farmers. They've stolen farmland from people who purchased it after majority rule in 1980, which accounted for 42% of all commercial farmland, which was stolen from people who bought it with the government's approval, and then dispersed to people who weren't experienced in farming, had no access to water, as the land was divided up in a haphazard fashion, and the sector collapsed. Now, who's going to want to invest in a country like that where the government doesn't even follow its own laws? That's Zimbabwe. Malawi has had challenges since 2000 with a capricious government, had a president who fired on demonstrators who were opposed to his policies, and we've seen other challenges there. South Africa, of course, has many challenges when it comes to crime, internal stability issues, political challenges. The Gambia, famously. Mali, of course, a conflict that is raging still to this day. South Sudan imploded into a civil war. Central African Republic imploded into a civil war. Somalia remains largely in chaos since the early 1990s. And Comoros, the land of one coup after another, has famously had at least one coup attempt since 2000. So internal instability remains a problem. Businesses don't like to take risk in dangerous places. They're going to avoid it. So who else do we have in the chat here now? Let me see who else has popped in. Gus is here. Welcome, Gus. Good to see you. So this is an inaugural strategic video I'm trying to do for the channel for the platoon leader and master and commander level. Originally intended for the master and commander, but I've extended it to the platoon leader level. So today's topic is U.S. trade with Africa. So this video is only for members at those levels at the moment. I'll leave it up for members, and then eventually I'll release it so that it'll be on the channel so others can watch it. Hopefully you find this interesting. Now, supply chain management. This is a real problem across Africa because, as I mentioned earlier, with weak industrial base, it's difficult to get replacement parts and supplies oftentimes. Many people have to build their entire supply chain management system themselves in order to do business in Africa. And that's a non-starter. It takes a lot of capital to be responsible for an entire supply chain, and supply chains can be quite complicated and immense, and that overhead is simply too much for business to do business in Africa. And then financing. Financing can be a major problem when it comes to operating in Africa. People backing, it's a higher risk in many cases, or perceived as a higher risk, so that's a challenge. So these are some of the challenges for U.S. businesses trying to do business in Africa. Here's some more. Well, weak legal systems, and this is not a trivial issue. So for instance, dispute settlement. If you are in the Gabon and you buy something from a supplier and they fail to deliver, what's your recourse? Do you report it to the police? Okay, let's say they take a report. Can you sue that supplier? Does the court system function? Is it a legitimate court system? Well, across Africa, that isn't always the case. So your right of redress or your recourse when you've been defrauded or you've been cheated or you've been delivered something substandard or someone simply fails to follow through on a business deal, which is common in much of Africa, you have no redress. You have no right of recourse. This is a significant stumbling block. And this is one of the challenges for the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which doesn't adequately address this. It needs to be addressed in that trade agreement or it's just a piece of paper, along with copyright and intellectual property protections. So high transaction cost, yet another challenge for U.S. businesses trying to operate in Africa. So for instance, most credit cards in Africa, banks charge an excessive fee for them. For instance, in South Africa, for a long period of time, the bank oligarchy that's there the cabal of 5 large banks charged merchants 5% for transactions. 5%. By comparison, Visa and MasterCard were charging 1.8% on average to merchants here in the U.S. for transactions. Now, some of that's understandable because there are fewer transactions, so the banks need to make more money off a lower volume. But 5%, that's a massive break on economic growth. When the merchant has to pay 5% for every transaction, every time you buy something, if you're using a credit card, that's a problem. Banking costs are excessive in Africa. Most Americans are accustomed to being able to go to a bank and get banking for free, not paying for checking or for savings or anything, because the bank has your money and you're giving it to them, so they're giving you something in return, usually no-fee banking, free checking, free savings, things like that. But not in Africa. In Africa, oftentimes consumers pay excessive rates to have bank accounts. As a consequence, many Africans have no access to formal banking systems around the continent and rely on excessively overcharged things like money senders like Western Union and MoneyGram, or they rely on M-Pesa, these electronic means to send things, and it's really, really a mess. So let's see what we have here. We have Gus is saying merchant costs in South Africa are lower nowadays. Yes, they've come down, Gus, but I'm saying historically, and I was just giving South Africa as an example. They remain high across many parts of the continent. So thank you for sharing that, Gus. But that has historically been a problem. It remains a problem in much of the continent. Now, there are also artificial borders or artificial barriers to trade for American businesses. So what about border crossings and port clearances? It can be excessive and be timely, particularly in a place where corruption is endemic. If you deliver something to a port, will it get out of the port in time for the goods to reach the consumers so you can meet your obligations under contract? Or if it's perishable, it gets where it needs to go before it perishes. Or if it's technology, it gets where it needs to go before it's outdated. You laugh when I say outdated, but when a container sits in a port for 9 months, those things in there may not be in condition they can actually be of any use to consumer. And so that's a real consideration. So artificial barriers across the continent are a real issue. Imagine sitting at the ferry crossing in Kasane up by Chobe in Botswana, coming across the Chobe River and sitting there for 5 days waiting for port clearance or customs clearance to get on the ferry to go between Zambia and Botswana. It's insane. And this causes additional cost to occur. For instance, when I lived in Liberia, this was not an artificial barrier, it was an actual barrier, and it wasn't intentional. It's just a consequence of Liberia's 13-year civil war. What we had in Liberia was a situation in which the free port of Monrovia had just one berthing available. That's because the other major berthing that was available was being occupied by the Mercy Ship, which is a non-government organization that provided free medical care for Liberians. So that left one berth, because the other berths had all been destroyed by the Civil War. There's a massive hole in the pier in which the concrete had collapsed. Then there's a I can't remember the name of it, there was a ship there that sank as well. So one was a sunk ship, which was never cut up and took years to cut up and get rid of. Another, the pier had been destroyed, so that left just one berth for the entire country in its major port. Only one cargo ship at a time could deliver goods into Monrovia. As a consequence, ships would line up for days out around Monrovia at sea, sitting there, burning diesel, burning fuel, and costing salaries and time and driving up the cost of everything that came into the country because the shippers had to recoup their costs, so they charged more for the delivery, which pushed up the price of consumer goods. So these sort of barriers are legitimate and a serious impediment to doing business in Africa. What about corruption? Well, corruption is a major issue as well. For instance, in South Africa, we have this whole system of state capture in which the ruling political parties' elites have used the apparatus of the state to pilfer from the public. And this undermines confidence, undermines investor worthiness to go into a country. And then you also have issues of petty corruption. If you're in a business, say you go to Ghana and you're doing business there and you're making chocolate in Ghana, buying the cocoa that's there, producing chocolate in Africa to sell it. And you're accustomed to living in, say, in France or Switzerland where you don't deal with petty corruption. And then every time you turn around, you're being stopped by the police and shaken down for bribes, or your suppliers are stopped and they demand bribes and people bring your supplies. Yeah, this becomes a real problem, ladies and gentlemen. Petty corruption is something that eviscerates confidence and drives investors away from places like Africa. It's pervasive. We also have the issue with, and we see this all over, but particularly in South Africa, we see this where state-owned entities, state-owned enterprises or parastatals have their corporate boards stuffed full of political allies or cadres, people unqualified. We saw this with South African Airways, unqualified people who knew nothing about the industry, sitting on corporate boards making decisions or sitting in management for corporations and making decisions they're wholly unqualified for. This sort of problem is pandemic or endemic across the continent, and it causes major problems for investors who want to go to Africa. And of course, the state-owned enterprise themselves. So they are competitors, unfair competitors. So for instance, South African Airways and Ethiopian are both state-owned enterprises. There's two significant differences. South African Airways is mismanaged and interfered with by the government on an hourly basis. As a consequence, it's a disaster, it's a bankrupt enterprise, and it should have been liquidated, but it has not been liquidated yet. By contrast, Ethiopian is also a state-owned enterprise, but it is managed as a private entity, although the state controls the company. It owns the company, it doesn't run it. So it's actually controlled by the people who run it, who are professional and business people. Now, that's a very different situation. So Ethiopia can have a state-owned airline that's successful, but it crowds out private operators because the state owns it and the state has advantages that private operators don't have. Every time a diplomat for a state goes somewhere, they can shill for the airline. And I've seen this. Ethiopian officials, diplomatic officials at events and around the world and trade fairs, government officials who have access to places and people that people from outside the country want to have access to inside the government are able to provide that because they work for the government and they're advertising and promoting Ethiopian Airlines. They don't do that for a private carrier. And that's a disadvantage. We see this across Africa. In South Africa, for instance, famously, when the repatriation flights took place, South African Airways was given the contracts to bring people back from around the world, and Comair was denied these contracts. One of the reasons Comair had to go into business rescue in order to save resources, conserve resources, hopefully to come out of business rescue or bankruptcy protection. Because South African Airways was getting all the tenders, whereas a fair process for private marketplace would have picked the best or divided up equally amongst others. Yes, so we also have problems in the U.S. because the U.S. has laws against malfeasance by U.S. actors. So if, for instance, Chinese officials come to the Congo and they want to invest in a copper mine in Katanga, well, they may be able to get that contract because they're able to pay bribes. But American officials, if they're caught and identified, they can be tried by U.S. courts for this corruption abroad. And so that is something that Americans can't be engaged. That doesn't mean Americans never engage in corruption. What I'm saying is that they can be caught and prosecuted for it, but that does not happen by and large in other countries. That's disadvantageous for American businesses seeking to do trade and business in Africa. They have to live by U.S. laws and obey U.S. laws, not just local laws. And then finally, when it comes to challenges, is copyright and trademark infringement. There are folks across the continent who steal and reproduce and copy all sorts of intellectual property items and all the time. And this is a major impediment as well. This is a challenge for U.S. businesses protecting their copyright and avoiding trademark infringement for their original content, their original ideas across the continent. It's difficult to do. Very few countries do a serious job of policing this sort of thing. South Africa is one that actually does it. There are others. But by and large, most of Africa, people are buying fake Levi's all the time. No idea that they didn't come from Levi because no one polices it. And that's a problem because you lose business to illegitimate or pirated activities. And that's a problem for American businesses in Africa, not just American business. So all these bad things, all these challenges, why would you want to do business in Africa if you're an American business? Well, let's talk about that. Well, for the U.S. government, there's a reason that we want people to do business in Africa and why we want to be engaged in Africa. The U.S. government would like to have access and influence across the continent. Why? So that we have favorable relations with nations across Africa when the time is appropriate, for whatever purpose that may be, whether that's increasing U.S. trade to Africa, or it's having a reliable partner when it comes to a conflict, or it's having a reliable partner when the U.S. is looking for or seeking assistance in a United Nations vote or in a regional body or something like that. Yeah. So the U.S. government, Washington, D.C., its interests in Africa are access and influence. That's what it wants. And that's reasonable. That's what any country that's engaged in Africa is looking for, access and influence. Now, the private sector should look to Africa for opportunity. As I mentioned, Africa currently has a population of 1.3 billion people, and that will rise to 2.3 to 2.4 billion people no matter what we do by the year 2050. So just 3 decades from today, the continent will be nearly twice as large as it is today in terms of people. And that includes all the people who leave Africa to go to China, to go to Europe, to go to the Western Hemisphere, to the US, Canada. Despite that, it'll still have a population that size. Someone else has came in the chat. Hey, Jacques, good to see you there. It's my pleasure for the presentation. I hope you're finding it interesting. I appreciate you guys joining me. So let me get back to this. Right, so Africa does have many of the fastest growing economies. And here's the thing. Many of them are from a low base. So Mozambique famously has had a rapidly growing economy since 1992, since the end of the civil conflict. But that's because Mozambique came back from the abyss. There was virtually no infrastructure left in the country. All the businesses were greatly harmed by this. Massive international assistance poured in. There was debt relief under the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries Initiative, and they expanded HIPC, that's HIPC and expanded HIPC, wiped out Mozambique's debt, gave it a clean slate by and large, and then lots of money poured in on top of that. So all that money pouring in from assistance and abroad, plus the fact that the country was virtually destroyed, led to massive economic growth sustained over a period of a number of years. So Mozambique is coming back from nothing. But many of these countries in Africa are very small. But that doesn't mean they'll always remain small. The GDP of some of these countries is quite small. Looking at, for instance, Niger, a country of 23 million, the total GNP for that country is $9 billion. $9 billion, ladies and gentlemen. I can list hundreds of American corporations that have more revenue than that every single year that only employ a few thousands of people. Yet the entire country of Niger has a GDP of $9 billion. So, fast-growing economies in many cases, but often very small. But rapidly growing is something that investors like to see because you can get a quick return on your investment, increasing your sales, increasing your contact with a market like that. So that's good. As I mentioned, exploding population, there you go, 1.3 billion to 2.3 to 2.5 billion in 30 years. Now, the rapidly growing consumer class, I've also mentioned that already. 300 million is my estimate in 2019, but by 2015, I expect it to be about 800 and 900 million consumers. These are people who have disposable income. Now, let's be fair. Most consumers in Africa aren't at the same level of a Japanese consumer or a West European consumer or an American consumer who typically has far more money at their disposal. But what I mean by consumer class is that once you've met all your basic needs for housing, for food, for safety, security, all the things you need, school fees, whatever it is, once those things have been met, if you have any money left over, that's disposable income, and that's the consumer class. And my projection is that by the year 2050, that consumer class in Africa will be 800 to 900 million people. The entire U.S. population is 330 million today. You want to talk about an amazing business opportunity? This is it. This is the El Dorado of the 21st century, ladies and gentlemen. Also, improved governance. 61% of the continent now has multi-party democracies, which I alluded to earlier. So it's not a continent full of socialist, communist, state-controlled, corrupt, coup d'etat military regimes. No, some of that still exists across the continent, but 61% of the continent now has multi-party democracy. Mobile telephony has allowed Africa to leapfrog into the 21st century. If you go back to the 1990s, before mobile telephones in Africa, we had to rely on landlines. And most countries had abysmal landline systems and abysmal sea connections to the rest of the world. So much of Africa was disconnected from the world. But mobile telephony is one example of how Africa has been able to leapfrog into the 21st century. And we see that now with mobile payments, with things like M-Pesa, and we'll see it with banking, mobile banking coming up, and many other things where African countries and Africans can leapfrog, and this can make it much easier to do business in Africa. And this is a great opportunity for American business. At least they should see it that way. Also, there are greater efforts at economic integration and harmonization across the continent. I've previously mentioned the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which has shortcomings, but it is a good step in the right direction. There are also the regional economic communities, such as ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, the Southern African Development Community, the East African Community, the Intergovernmental Agency for Development, IGAD, and multiple other regional economic communities, some of which have done a better job at regional integration, reducing barriers, and improving trade links. One of those that's done very well recently is the East African Community, which has greatly reduced trade barriers, and we've seen a big jump in inter-East African trade, which has been historically a problem. African countries, by and large, didn't trade amongst each other, with the exception of Southern Africa, where there's a very close-knit community because of SADC and historical South African influence. Outside of that, the rest of the continent, countries didn't trade much with each other. They traded with the metropole. So if you were part of the French Empire, then you had a long history of trading with France. And so more business between Senegal and France occurred than Senegal and any of its neighbors. And so that still lingers today. You have very little intra-African trade, but it is improving. And East African Community is one example of that. And then finally, you had this thing called the Tripartite Free Trade Area, which predates the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. That included almost half the countries in Africa, or about half, 26 countries, so yeah, almost half the countries in Africa, from Egypt all the way down the eastern side to southern Africa. And this was meant to do much what the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is now doing. So these are efforts to harmonize trade across the continent, and they pose potential opportunities and improvements for doing business if they're successful. So things are changing. The U.S., as I mentioned, is no longer Africa's largest trade partner. That occurred in 2013. It's now China. And aid has fallen in some disrepute. We see lots of people, analysts and in the financial sector, as well as aid workers and government authorities who now look on aid with a bit of disdain. Amongst politicians and intellectuals, it's not quite the shiny toy that it once was. People question the trillions of dollars of aid that have poured into the developing world, in particular Africa. What have we gotten for it? And there's also a new scramble for Africa. I'm not talking about the 19th century Berlin Conference, the scramble for Africa. But what I'm talking about is that there are a lot of different countries who have interest in Africa these days. For instance, it's not just the United States and China who have interest, or the European Union. No. Ladies and gentlemen, you see other actors coming in a major way. India, which has a long link to Africa as a consequence of Indian diaspora. You see large Indian communities in East Africa, in Kenya in particular. There used to be one in Uganda. Of course, Idi Amin famously kicked it out. Some came back. But Kenya, you also see that in Tanzania. You see it in South Africa and other locations in Africa. And then you also have a large Lebanese community, business community in West Africa, in places like Cote d'Ivoire, which have ties back to the Levant. But beyond that, so India I mentioned, but beyond that, Turkey is a major actor in Africa now. One of the major investors in Africa, especially places like Ethiopia, expanding air links across the continent and investing with foreign direct investment in Africa, especially East Africa. But not just Turkey, Brazil has an interest there as well. So there are a lot of non-traditional actors who are scrambling to get into Africa and do business. If U.S. businesses sit on the sideline in 2050, the United States will be a second-rate economic power on this globe. There's no question about it. Because the growth in the future is not occurring in America, it's not occurring in Europe, it's not occurring in Asia. Asia is leveling off and plateauing, ladies and gentlemen, and China is not raging and roaring up the pipe like people think they are. They've now stagnated as well. Pre-COVID-19, they were in trouble. COVID-19, they're in serious trouble. That doesn't mean China's rise is over. It just means that it's not meteoric like it once was, and it shouldn't be. So there you go. U.S. has been losing ground to these competitors I mentioned here. But inside Africa, we've lost ground to China, because we're largely not engaged. U.S. businesses just aren't there. They're not paying attention, whereas Chinese business is paying attention to Africa. Russia is getting more deeply engaged in Africa, and not just in arms sales, but also looking in mining concessions and things like that. The European Union is trying to harmonize its rules across the Union rather than having bilateral agreements. Brazil, Turkey, as I mentioned, Morocco. Morocco is part of Africa, but Morocco is heavily invested in West Africa, particularly in Francophone countries, in all sorts of business, in the service industry. Moroccans have been clever. They've been buying up banks and buying up insurance firms across West Africa, relying on the fact that they had the common lingua franca of French initially, but then also leveraging their experience in their successful businesses in Morocco and applying those models and adapting them to local situations. And Moroccan firms have been very successful in West Africa, and almost no one has noticed. South Africa has a long record of getting involved in Africa. We've seen companies like ShopRite, MTN, and many others spread their wings across Africa, whether it's in Kenya or Uganda or Nigeria, although we recently seen some pullback from Nigeria. But nonetheless, South Africa is another candidate who's a competitor. So all these countries, Russia, India, China, the European Union, Brazil, Turkey, Morocco, South Africa, all are competitors for American business. But they're engaged. American business is not, by and large. And this is a challenge, ladies and gentlemen, for American business going forward. So what are we talking about when we talk about foreign direct investment? So here you go. Here's the picture of foreign direct investment. The USA does remain Africa's top foreign direct investment contributor, but we have largely, historically, had an overemphasis on hydrocarbons, natural gas, and petroleum, those sorts of things. But that is concentrated in just 5 countries. Most U.S. foreign direct investment in Africa goes to South Africa, Morocco, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Gabon. Now you look at that list and you see, Gabon is oil. Ethiopia, wonder what that is. Anyway, so there's a lot of variety there when it comes to foreign direct investment. Now, our U.S. foreign direct investment began to pick up pace again in 2019 with Amazon and Google announcing investment in South Africa. Ford and Anadarko also mentioning increasing investments in Africa. There are some top universally recognized brands, as I alluded to earlier, Coca-Cola, Boeing, Caterpillar, that are well known across the continent, also involved heavily in foreign direct investment in Africa. Now, the USA has 5.6 million employer firms in this country. 5.6 million. That was in 2016. The number is higher today, although it may have dropped off with COVID-19. But beginning of 2020, it was higher than 5.6 million. Think about that. 5.6 million different businesses that have employees in this country. But just 30,000 of them are doing business. And as I mentioned earlier, most of that 30,000 aren't really doing much in the way of business. Just a handful of companies are actually doing it. And it's dominated by the big names. So there's incredible potential for small and medium-sized businesses in the U.S. to get involved across Africa for the mutual benefit of Africans and for Americans. Now, there's an equally large opportunity for major U.S. brands that are virtually non-existent or are non-existent in Africa. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you live in Africa, have you ever heard of Sprint? Sprint is a major telecommunications company, although it's merging with another company here with mobile phones and long-distance services, but they're not in Africa. Why does MTN get to have all the attention? Why does Econet get to have all the attention? Comcast. Comcast is a massive corporation. It owns NBC, Universal, so movie studios, television networks, sports, news. Also owns a massive cable network, owns programming all over the United States. Why isn't Comcast in Africa? It has the capital, and if it were clever, it would be in Africa in some respect. Charles Schwab. Charles Schwab is the original discount brokerage firm in the United States. They pioneered the industry, courtesy of Charles Schwab, named after him. And they're still around today, and they're doing amazing stuff. You can have a brokerage account in America and trade stocks and pay nothing. You pay nothing for it because the system they now set up, they found a way to make money without charging you for the trades, which used to be prohibitive for investors. So now even small-scale investors can invest and have a brokerage account. Why isn't Charles Schwab offering these services to Africans? There are stock exchanges in Africa. Why aren't they doing that? AIG, American International Group, a massive insurance corporation. While the Moroccans are cleverly snapping up and getting involved and doing joint deals with insurance companies all over West Africa, why is AIG not there? AIG is in Japan. Why aren't they in Africa? So these are opportunities wasted and left on the wayside, if you ask me, ladies and gentlemen. So let me talk about some lily pads for places where American firms could do business. Now, this is not all-inclusive. It's not exclusive. It's just a little food for thought and some ideas and some reasons and industries why American businesses might want to go to some of these places. So let's start with this. All right, so Mauritius. Mauritius, located off the coast of Africa right there, just the other side of Madagascar. Small little island, interesting governance, well-governed. And there's opportunity in textiles, transportation, telecoms, banking, insurance, reinsurance, and tourism. The banking may be a bit of a challenge because it's long established, as well as the textiles. But all those industries are businesses where people can make money. The challenge, of course, is Mauritius is very tiny, just 1.2 million people, and geographically, it's contained. It's an island. You're not going to go any further once you hit the limits. Nonetheless, it is a possible potential lily pad. You could set up a business there, get success, and get introduced to Africa, and then branch out from there. Now, another one that comes to mind is Rwanda. Rwanda is open for business, ladies and gentlemen, located in East Central Africa. Rwanda, of course, famous for the genocide in 1994, sadly, but Rwanda is also a country where there's a manufacturing base that's growing. Volkswagen has built a plant there to manufacture cars for East Africa. Food processing, information technology, tourism, mountain gorillas, and agriculture are all burgeoning markets in the country. Now, this is a medium-sized country with over 11 million people. Figures actually a little higher than that right now, but that's an opportunity as well. It's well governed. The business laws are easy to deal with, and it's very easy to set up a business. So that's a potential launching pad for East Africa. You could put your business in Rwanda, grow it in Rwanda, make it established, make it profitable, and then reach out from there. That's what I mean by the lily pad pitch. Botswana, ladies and gentlemen. Botswana is a fantastic country, well governed, right on the border of South Africa. So you have the advantage of being right adjacent to South Africa, and its economy, in many respects, is simply an extension of South Africa's economy. Most of the businesses you find in South Africa have branches in Botswana, and doing business between the two is quite simple. Registering a business in Botswana is very simple. It just takes a few days, a very small fee, and you're off and running. And they have an honest court system. You have a right of redress in Botswana. The police are honest, legitimate. The infrastructure is there. Lots of things, especially look for higher up the value chain. So you want to do things like IT, information technology, insurance, banking, advertising, tourism, horticulture, pharmaceuticals, all vast opportunities. Now, the challenge, once again, is Botswana is very small. But since it's the Southern African Development Community and it's essentially an extension of South Africa's economy, by getting into Botswana, in many respects, you're getting that 2.1 million, add 58 million for South Africa. So you're really getting a market of 60 million by getting into Botswana. So it's a smart place to do business, folks. All right, the next one, Cape Verde. Cape Verde, located off the northwest coast of Africa. It's an island nation settled by the Portuguese originally. Now they say Cabo Verde because they use the actual Portuguese name for it, but Cape Verde, seafood, tourism, light manufacturing. It's an outlier because it has a very small economy and virtually no foreign direct investment gets there. And that's why I say it's potential lily pad. It's an honest government with good governance. It's isolated and far away, but it's not that far away from Europe, so you might use it as a lily pad for Europe and Africa, depending on your business. A very small population, 540,000, but since there's so little foreign direct investment, that does present an opportunity as a lily pad. Morocco. I mentioned Morocco earlier in Northwest Africa. Morocco has a robust manufacturing sector, great tourism opportunities. Lots of tourists go there, from Europe especially. Agriculture, massive agricultural potential. Insurance, as I mentioned, banking, and the media. And so that's a larger country with 35.7 million people. So there's lots of opportunity there. And there's also the Francophone connection with Francophone West Africa and also with France. So you get a lot of advantages by going to Morocco. Honest, well-run government. Senegal. Senegal is located in West Africa, although it's not showing up in my pictures down there. Opportunities in Senegal. It's another smaller country, a mid-size, agriculture, tourism, food processing, and information technology. Those are all opportunities there. So here you go, folks. This is the bottom line when it comes to trade with Africa. This is my quote. This is a line that I came up with, so I'm not quoting someone else. And I said that U.S. business needs to awake to the coming immense size and enormous economic potential of Africa, or risk not only losing out to current competitors, but of falling too far behind in what will be one of the largest consumer markets and places for growth potential. Africa is the next big thing. Africa is the next El Dorado. So there you go, folks. That's my presentation. I hope you found that interesting. Let me shut that down here. And this was, as I mentioned, this is a video for the Master and Commander, but I've opened it up to the platoon leader level as a strategic video for my members on Chris Wine Africa. I hope you found that interesting. Let me look in chat and see if you guys have any questions or any comments. Okay. No, I don't see any comments there. All right. Well, thank you guys so much. Let me see if I can say a few more things about what's going on here. So, for instance, the issue from my perspective is that the U.S. government and African governments need to do a much better job in attracting U.S. businesses to Africa. This is mutually beneficial, ladies and gentlemen. It's not just something that Americans will make money off of. It's also something that will bring foreign direct investment into Africa and also will benefit Africa by increasing trade between the two. So there you go. Here's the bottom line. America doesn't need Africa when it comes to trade. Sorry, I don't mean to hurt anybody's feelings, but that's just the reality. Virtually nothing in Africa is a must-have for the United States. Virtually nothing. We can find substitutes or just do without. And the volume of trade will cost very few jobs in the United States. We'll make it up elsewhere. But for Africans, the U.S., despite its low level of trade with Africa as a whole, is 4% of African trade, and that's a big impact on Africans. So Africans should be more, or at least as much, focused on this issue that I'm proposing here, paying attention to encouraging American business to come to Africa as America is, because it's critically important to Africa. So Jacques says, how is technology impacting lily padding? Well, it can enhance it. So for instance, one of my arguments there, Jacques, is that in places like Mauritius and in Cape Verde, which are geographically disconnected from the continent because they're island states, you can leverage information technology for your business. So if you're providing services, you can do it through information technology, and you can set up your businesses there so you're close to Africa. Now, the advantage of going to Africa as opposed to, say, keeping your business in Peoria or in California is you can be in similar time zones. So your workforce doesn't have to be strung out and up at 3 o'clock in the morning or something like that. So there are advantages to it. Plus, you have legitimacy and credibility by being in Africa itself. It's hard to have legitimacy if you're not experienced in Africa and you're also not located in Africa. If you have experience in Africa, you can be located outside of it, and then you have credibility, like me. But if you don't have experience in Africa and you're trying to do business in Africa, you lack that credibility if you don't have an African connection. So one of the purposes of Lily Pads is to give you an African connection regardless of your business. So people who are software companies, my recommendation to them is to find a good lily pad and set up an operation there so you're inside the continent. It also gives you insights. You can tailor your business to local and regional interest if you better understand them. You better understand them by being present. So for instance, things that are of interest to people in Botswana, South Africa, and Namibia, you might be able to read about that. You might be able to get a high-paid consultant like me, although I'm not high-paid, but a consultant like me, to give you advice and recommendations how to do business, and that's great, and it can work for your company. But you get the true insights by having a presence, a physical presence there, and having employees in those countries that understand things, and they come with ideas and new concepts that you can expand your business. Oftentimes we see local ideas are ways for people to expand business that were never imagined, never thought of before. And let me give you an example, something not in an African context, but people are familiar with Post-its, those little yellow note things, the little stickies you put up and you put on your desk or something like that. That wasn't a mistake by an engineer at 3M, Minnesota Mining Manufacturing, based in Minnesota, one of the largest industrial conglomerates in the world. 3M wasn't intending to make those. The guy made an adhesive. They were trying to find an adhesive that could come off easy, and it stuck to paper or something like that. He goes, hey, I can make notes with this. And that's how it was born. A multi-billion-dollar business. 3M makes billions of dollars. It's $2 or $3 billion a year, I think it is now, they make off of selling Post-its. Can you imagine that? How many Post-its that is to make that much money? But it's not just 3M. Hundreds, if not thousands of companies around the world produce those little Post-its, which aren't card Post-its, they're little notepads, and they make money off of it. Just of a little simple idea like that. That was local content. And there are lots of great ideas in Africa. Africans always find a way, and those ideas can be very applicable. The concept of taking your mobile phone and sending money to someone and doing transactions is born in Africa. You see it in Tanzania and in Kenya with the M-Pesa concept. So if you're not in Africa, if you don't have a lily pad as a minimum, then you're going to miss out on those things, or you're going to be away from it when the development takes place. But you have a chance to potentially benefit from it being in Africa. So there you go. So, all right, Jacques, I'm glad that clarified. I hope that was helpful. Okay, folks, I don't know how you feel about this or what you thought about this. This was a first stab at it. I thought I'd get this done because I hadn't done one yet. So this is the strategic video, and this one's about U.S. trade with Africa from Chris White Africa. So I hope that my members enjoyed this and found it useful. This will be for members only for now, but I will open this up to the wider public sometime soon. So I'd appreciate your feedback. Either send me a note or comment on the video if you can see the video link, and then I'll take a look at the comments. I do appreciate it. I thank you for your time. And this will be one time that I'm actually going to do a stream for 1 hour and call it at that. So we're at 58, almost 59 minutes. So I want to thank you so much for, by the way, for you guys for being members. I really appreciate that. And I hope you do like this. By the way, I hope you enjoyed the presentation. If you did, look at it in this way. This is the sort of thing that somebody would pay me $1,500 to go do. I would get $1,500, $2,000 to go speak for 45 minutes on this topic, and you just got that. It was a little artificial because I'm doing it in front of a camera, but anyway, so that sounds like a bargain, huh? I think it's a bit of a bargain. Anyway, I enjoyed it. I hope you guys enjoyed it. So thanks a lot. Have a pleasant day. Look for me later. I'll be doing at least one prepared video because I didn't get my video congratulating Niger on their 60th Independence Day. I'm going to do that one here shortly. That'll be posted, and I'll also be doing stray voltages later in the day. So thanks a lot, folks. I appreciate it. To all my members, Vihan, Jock, everyone else who was here, thank you so much. Have a pleasant day, and thanks for tuning in. And stay tuned for more videos from members under members perks. All right, folks, have a good day. Thank you so much. And I'm going to close out right here. Where's it at? Okay.